We can bring you more on our top story now and the new funding model for schools to be unveiled today. To discuss the potential changes, we're joined by Dr. Tim Hawkes, the principal of the King's School in Sydney, and in Canberra by Angelo Gavrielatos, the federal president of the Australian Education Union. And Tim, we will start with you, if I may. Are you excited about the announcement or the speech that's going to be delivered by the Prime Minister Julia Gillard today? Are you as excited as the government says we should be?
Well, I don't know about excited, Paul, but look, it's a good news story. It's got to be a good news story. 1.9 million Australian students, I think, are going to be significantly better off. And it's good to see Gonski, at least in part, being implemented. And look, the lovely thing about these suggestions, it seems to me that it protects the idea of basic entitlement. We've got about 10,000 per student at secondary level and about 8,000 or so at primary level. It protects the idea of basic entitlements. But on top of that, there are extra payments for students with disabilities, for Indigenous students, for students with special needs in some way, shape or form, isolated students, students with language needs and so on and so forth. And I think that this is a very, very good news story. I think I'm probably not quite so, catatonic with pleasure in as much as that I don't think there are huge, great surprises here. But on the other hand, it's good to see the whole thing being progressed, albeit, I have to say, Paul, progressed enormously slowly. And here we have the Prime Minister being massively generous with monies and grants and so on and so forth, which we're not actually going to see the full rollout until 2020, for goodness sake. And so, although we begin the process in 2014, and the rollout continuing on to 2019, that's still a fair way off for many, many students who really do need the funding somewhat earlier than is being suggested. So, look, a good news story generally, disappointed about the timeline. We still need to see a lot of the details. Some of this funding's being linked to things like productivity improvements in the classroom and so on and so forth. We've actually got to see the detail of that, but generally I think a good news story.
Angelo Gavrielatos, I'll bring you in here. What do you make of the time frame?
A transition period of 6 years is certainly not something that is desired. But that said, the significance of the structural reform about to be announced and about to begin cannot be overstated. We're about to see the end of a funding system that is broken and failing our children and the nation as a whole. And the government will embrace a funding system consistent with the Gonski principles, which will see our public schools become the major beneficiaries of the additional investment. We're going to see additional resources start to flow into our schools to allow our teachers and school leaders to develop and implement proven programs that will provide every child with a greater opportunity to reach their full potential. This is about ensuring that every child can reach their full potential. This is about lifting overall performance and addressing underachievement. So we certainly welcome the commencement of the transition in 2014, but clearly the transition period is much longer than what we would have preferred.
And the Prime Minister, will stay with you there, Angelo. The Prime Minister will talk today about reaching a top 5 level internationally and put that into a bill by the end of the year. What do you make of this goal setting?
Look, we always, setting targets is always important, and we certainly do so in our schools. In our schools, we constantly engage in an evaluation of teaching and learning programs. We constantly engage in setting targets, improvement targets. What we will now see, though, is the resourcing starting to flow into our schools to help us reach those targets. Targets are good, but they've got to be properly resourced and properly supported.
Tim Hawkes, you'd be involved in goal setting, I guess, as school leader. Do you often set goals that are so far ahead?
Well, listen, we operate on a 10-year cash flow, and so we are looking at that sort of time frame, Paul. But and look, these are significant reforms. They are going to take time to bring on in. But I think, people talk about, oh, we've got to do it carefully and properly, and that's the reason for the time. Well, listen, most of us recognise that the reason for the time is the government hasn't got the money, for goodness sake. Yeah. And it also needs to win the support of the states. And this is going to be somewhat problematic. Some of the states just haven't got the money. And as I said, the Prime Minister being massively generous perhaps in her gifting of monies, and quite properly so too, may I say. I mean, I think this is, as I said, is a good news story. but she probably is not going to be the one that's going to have to pay for it. So that's going to be a fairly interesting conundrum for future governments, which she's gifted with this particular burden. But so she should. I mean, I don't want to sort of just suggest that this is inappropriate. This is a very, very necessary reform, I think, for education. We've been looking for it for some time. Angelo is actually quite right. The last funding system has been flawed. The SES system, with about 50% of schools being excused the obligation to be bound for it, was unworkable. And so we needed this new system. And I think as far as various models and options are, it's actually a very good model.
A question for both of you. I'll start with you on this one, Angelo. Does this new funding proposal sideline the public versus private debate, and is that at all significant?
Well, ultimately, what's exciting about this proposal is the injection of a significant amount of additional money. We're going to see the investment of significant dollars, and consistent with the Gonski review, $5 billion, in fact, annually in 2009 money, $3.8 billion of which, 75% of which would go to government schools. And that's important because it's in recognition of the fact that government schools operate in every community and open to every child, but also it recognises the fact that government schools do the heavy lifting when it comes to educating our children with disadvantage. 80% of low SES kids, 85% of Indigenous kids, 80% of students with disabilities, including those with the most severe disabilities and the like, are in our government schools. So this funding system recognises the role of public schools and invests appropriately to ensure that we can meet the needs of our children.
And Tim Hawkes?
Well, I would agree. Curiously enough, I don't often agree with Angelo, but I actually think that this is actually very good. We need to target the majority of this money to the students who need it most. And there's absolutely no question that our education, for example, of Indigenous students is a national disgrace, and we've really got to lift our game. And I think that most Australians will take absolutely no pleasure in the current system, which sees too many of our students failing. We have slipped down the rankings in terms of our international comparisons with other nations. We've got to lift that, and more of the same is clearly not the answer. So this, I think, generally is a very good and productive step forward in trying to solve that sort of problem.
Tim, what are teachers looking for from this revolution, if you want to call it that, the Gonski review? What did they make of it, and what are they looking to in their workplace? Because ultimately it falls with teachers to educate children.
Well, it certainly is, and you can look at all those sorts of variables, but in the end, the biggest single variable in terms of student outcome is in fact the quality of the teacher. And I have to say that I do not believe that teacher training is of a higher enough standard. I think the tertiary institutions which are responsible for training our teachers are generally doing a fairly ordinary job. And I think we've got to lift our game in that area, and I'm glad to see that some of this funding may well be predicated on some improvement in that area. I have to say that teachers are looking for resources. Money by itself, by the way, is not just going to solve this problem. And I think that there is some discussion at the moment about there being more accountability. This is something which causes shivers, down the spines of many people. But I actually think we need that. I think we need more devolution of responsibility to the heads of schools, to the principals of schools, to be able to hire and fire. And this will be something which may well worry Angelo and the education unions and so on and so forth. I actually think it's really, really necessary. And if we want to try and lift the game of schools, it's not just a question of giving them money. It is actually also a question of looking at things like teacher morale, teacher pay, being able to attract into the profession quality people, men and women, and to reward them appropriately. And I think we've got to look at these sorts of things. We've got to look at the quality of their training, and we've got to look at as well as resourcing these teachers appropriately so that they can actually bring us back up to the top 5 sort of finish, which I know the Prime Minister is looking for in terms of our performance in reading and maths. And
Angelo, I'm interested to hear what you have to say on this subject.
What our teachers are looking for most is the other additional resources to implement the programs that we know can work. Over the course of the last number of years, with the national partnerships and the initial investment in many of our schools, we were able to show that investment does make a difference. As I said earlier, investing in our schools, investing in our